Zoom, a little voice told me that this is recording, which has not happened before. So apparently Zoom updated. So hopefully the little automatic voice doesn't keep doing this over the course of the evening. All right, we're getting close to almost to 50 people. So we are so excited for you all to join us this evening. On behalf of the Lexington Historical Society, I would like to welcome everyone to our 50th anniversary of the 1971 anti-Vietnam War protest on Lexington Battle Green and the subsequent mass arrest, which was the largest in state history. We are joined tonight by Elise Lemire, who is the author of a new book about the incident that took place on the Green and the entire march that took place over the course of that week, as well as two of our participants from the protest, Norma Norland and Bestor Cram. For those of you who haven't joined us for a webinar before, this is being held in what is called a webinar style fashion. So you will be able to see us. We will not be able to see you. If you hover down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a number of different options to interact with the panelists and with each other. There is a chat function at the bottom of the screen. If you have any technical questions or issues, or if you would like to chat amongst yourselves, share some of your memories if you were on the Green that day and that night, we would love to hear from you. And there is also a Q&A box down at the bottom, and this will allow you to ask us questions either as yourself or anonymously, and only the panelists and myself will be able to see what is actually going into that box. So after we have our brief presentation, we'll be chatting with our protesters and they will be answering your questions. So if you'd like to ask anything of them specifically, be sure to put that in the Q&A box just so that we make sure we'll be able to see it. And for anyone who hasn't joined Lexington Historical Society before for any of our programs, I would just like to very briefly welcome you all to our Historical Society and share with you a short video that tells a little bit more about what it is that we do.
Hello, my name is Chris Kaufman, and I'm the Education and Interpretation Manager at Lexington Historical Society. Lexington Historical Society is more than a historical society. We're storytellers, fact finders, educators, and community gatherers. Our historic house museums not only tell the stories of the past, but help us think about the world today and how we can shape the future. Every year, we welcome thousands of visitors to Lexington to learn about the first shots of the American Revolution. They come from around the world, around the country, and even right here in Massachusetts. In the community, we offer educational programs for both adults and children, including lectures, workshops, and summer camps. We work with local school districts to enhance their American history curricula so students can learn about history in an engaging way. Our recently completed Archives and Research Center offers state-of-the-art storage capabilities for our historical material, a new safe workspace for volunteers and staff, as well as an inviting, spacious research library for residents, scholars, and students. We hope you can join us for one of our programs, whether it's in person or virtual, or possibly take a tour of one of our museums. We love having community members get involved with us and enjoy the history of Lexington. You can help keep local history alive by supporting our important mission and donating today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone. And we would like to thank everyone who has donated to this program so far for helping to keep history alive. And without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Elise. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And a big thank you to the Lexington Historical Society for hosting this event tonight, which allows us to come together virtually to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Operation POW, organized by the New England chapter of Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and which had such a big impact here in Lexington. My job tonight is really just to set the scene, which will take me about 12 minutes, and then we'll get right to our panelists. So the tricky part, of course, is sharing screen and making sure that I do this properly. So just give me 1 second to start my slideshow. And we'll get going.
Looks perfect.
All right, there we go. I just have to shut this and we're off to the races. It was increasingly clear to thousands of American military personnel returning from Vietnam in the late 60s and early 70s that the United States was not going to be able to prevail against people who, since 1945, saw themselves as fighting a war for independence from imperial invaders, first against the French, who the Vietnamese vanquished in 1954, and then against the Americans, who invaded in 1964 after years of funding the French. Indeed, when Ho Chi Minh declared independence for Vietnam at the end of World War II, he quoted extensively from our Declaration of Independence. The organization Vietnam Veterans Against the War, or VVAW, which organized the March from Concord to Boston, was founded in 1967. In its early years, members wearing suits and ties attended marches, spoke at colleges and to the press, and campaigned for McCarthy. However, by the fall of 1970, it became clear that VVAW's tactics were not effective in ending the war. Even as President Nixon was drawing down ground troops, he was ramping up the air war in Southeast Asia, leaving those Americans still on the ground increasingly vulnerable, while raining death and destruction on an increasingly large region. Then too, Nixon and his supporters dramatically inflated the number of POWs by collapsing the traditionally distinct lists of POWs and MIAs, or prisoners of war and missing in action. The famous MIA POW bracelet campaign that put the names of the missing on the arms of Americans helped Nixon sell the continuation of the war to the American public on the grounds that the US couldn't leave Vietnam until all of these supposed American prisoners of war with whom the public had bonded, and really most of whom were likely dead, were returned. At this point, VVAW radically changed direction in order to more effectively raise awareness of what VVAW regarded as an immoral, illegal, genocidal, and seemingly endless war. For starters, those veterans who were against the war began to protest in fatigues. They wanted to make clear to the American public that their opposition to the war was based on firsthand experience of it. Secondly, veterans against the war looked for ways to establish that they were not traitors to their country, as some of Nixon's supporters kept insisting. They sought to establish that dissent is patriotic by staging their protests at sacred American places where they could highlight their sense of connection to and respect for the nation's founders. The first time VVAW did this was over Labor Day weekend in the fall of 1970, when some 200 veterans marched from Morristown, New Jersey to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, as a means of establishing a link with those men in the Continental Army who stayed loyal to the cause of liberty during 2 horrifically cold winters spent bivouacking at these locations. Here's a photograph taken 8 months later of members of VVAW on the Lexington Green with the steeple of the First Parish clearly visible in the background. The fatigues tell us these men know about the war, while details such as this peace bracelet and the John Lennon style glasses make clear this veteran opposes the war he knows so well. The fact of the veterans having come to Lexington in particular was a continuation of the earlier march to Valley Forge. Taking a stand against the war on the battle green aligned the anti-war veterans with the colonists who took a stand here on April 19, 1775. Thirdly, those veterans who opposed the war sought to make more clear than they could with speeches why they opposed it. While many Americans opposed the war on the grounds of its financial cost, Vietnam veterans who opposed the war did so on the grounds that atrocities like the My Lai massacre were not rare events, but rather regular occurrences. VVAW began reenacting in the streets the kind of brutal American search and destroy missions that were so deadly for Vietnamese civilians. In this picture, taken 6 weeks before the march through Lexington, Bostonians were going about their business when all of a sudden they saw fatigue-clad soldiers toting very realistic-looking toy M16s run onto Boston Common and begin to take people prisoners, interrogate them, and finally shoot them dead, as we see here happening in Government Center on the same day. Bystanders didn't immediately realize that the victims were volunteers who had rehearsed with the veterans and that this was thus guerrilla theater. The veterans' hope was that the momentary experience of terror would be so powerful that it would create empathy for the actual victims in Vietnam, as well as for the young American men forced to become ruthless killers. Here is VVAW carrying out a similar mock search and destroy mission in Concord's Monument Square mere hours before arriving in Lexington. 6 weeks before coming to Lexington, VVAW had become more assertive about staking a right to speak from national spaces. In mid-April, upwards of 1,200 veterans from across the country camped for 5 days on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., during which time they testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and threw away their service medals. When the federal government served the veterans an injunction in an attempt to oust them from the mall, the veterans voted to stay in a show of civil disobedience. A lot of Americans were appalled that the federal government would ask young men to risk their lives on the other side of the world and then not allow them to camp on the mall. On the right in this image, Senator Ted Kennedy is showing his support to tonight's panelist Bestor Cram and the other veterans after they voted to stay on the mall in defiance of the injunction. For our purposes tonight, it's important to note 2 things. One, that no arrests were made in DC because the park police refused to enforce the injunction. The park police simply couldn't stomach arresting men who had risked their lives for their country. Many of those assembled on the mall were missing limbs. Many times more were wearing Purple Hearts. 2, the press had largely ignored VVAW's efforts until this point. This is really important. It was the fact of an injunction that put VVAW on the front page of the nation's newspapers, as you can see here. VVAW became nationally and even internationally known that week. And again, we're talking about a period of 6 weeks prior to coming to Lexington. So by the time Bestor and the other New England veterans boarded the buses they had rented to head back to Massachusetts, they knew they had finally caught the public's attention. The question was how to keep it. The plan devised on the way home from DC was to continue to claim that dissent is rooted in patriotism, this time by marching Paul Revere's mythic route in reverse and thereby visiting not 2 Revolutionary War sites, as VVAW had done the fall before, but 4, Concord's Old North Bridge, the Battle Road, Lexington Battle Green, and Bunker Hill. Instead of marching in Revere's direction from Boston towards Concord, the veterans decided to march Revere's route in reverse, both in a sign of how far the nation had fallen from its founding ideals, and so the march could end with a rally on Boston Common. What the veterans didn't anticipate is that they would be served with a second injunction that once again would catch the notice of the national press. That brings us to the start of the march. But before we turn to our panelists, I want to show 2 pictures side by side. The first shows the veterans marching past Lexington's Minuteman statue onto the Battle Green. And the second is from last summer, when a new generation of young protesters also thought to raise their voices next to this iconic statue. I think these 2 pictures will help us keep in mind what we're talking about tonight. Why Lexington? What happened here such that it's the place to come to demand the end to a war or to demand that Black Lives Matter? So I'm going to keep showing some pictures for a little while longer while I pose some questions of Bestor. Bestor, thank you for being here tonight. As you can see, I'm showing the audience 3 pictures of you. In the first one, we see you as an officer in the Marines wearing your dress whites next to your wife. In the second, taken just a few years later in VVAW's New England office, located just off Harvard Square, you look quite different. And in the third, taken on April 14th, 1971, You've just orchestrated that mock search and destroy mission on Boston Common, and you and other veterans are walking to Government Center to repeat the performance in front of commuters and city workers. Tell us about the external and internal transformation you're reminded of when you look at these images.
Thank you very much, Elise. And I love, the juxtaposition that you're creating here. And I also just want to point out that you've stated up here that I was one of the co-coordinators, and my colleague was Arthur Johnson, who sadly recently just passed away. But he was an important part in my life in as the two of us became very engaged in thinking through the meaning of what we were doing and how to make it meaningful outside of our own lives. And I think that's a way to begin to answer your question, which is, number one, I look at these pictures and I see myself engaged in some active sense of trying to shape my own personal destiny, but also thinking a bit outside myself that, in fact, I was not going to be a bystander. I went to war because I was not going to be a bystander. I needed to know what was going on there. I felt compelled to be a participant in service. I will confess that I was probably competing with my father as well, who had been in the service during the Second World War. And so in some respects, I was following in his footsteps in something that had been a very honorable experience for him. But the other two pictures, which are post being in the service, are as much about not being a bystander as well. They're all about being an activist. They're all about, in some respects, taking the things that had been learned, just as much as I had taken what I had learned when I was in college and chose to become a Marine officer. Now I had chosen my most recent graduate degree, that which, having been 13 months in combat in Vietnam, had informed me a great deal about how to think about what I had participated in, but what also our nation was continuing to participate in, and what we individually and collectively needed to do about it. And so it's quite clear as I look at the third picture that I was not alone in my own thinking, that there was a group of us who had found each other when we returned from Vietnam. Actually, we had looked for each other out of a need to find common ground, to process the experience of having fought in a war that we had come to understand was illegal, was genocidal, was unjust, was something that required our service to continue in the sense of being patriots and sharing what we had learned and what we knew with others. So I'm here with two colleagues walking down, I think we're walking down Washington Street, if I recall exactly where we are, participating in a search and destroy mock theater presentation in which we were very much thinking we need to find ways in which to engage residents of Boston to come and question what we are doing as a way to begin to have a discussion about a question of what we had all been doing in the past and what was continuing to be done in our name.
Thank you. I'm so tempted to ask a follow-up question. I don't want to get out of time here, but could you just explain to everyone the transformation in your hair? Because I think for a lot of people, they might think it just has to do with some, transition of fashion. But of course, this is a really important part of who you are and who you were signifying you had become.
Well, throughout my time in the military, I had followed the rules and regulations of personal appearance. And so having been freed of those regulations, as well as joining a new culture that was emerging and was shaping its own cultural identity. The hair was, both the mustache and beard and the long hair was very much a part of belonging to that culture. as well as symbolizing sort of a rejection of the military experience and the military way of life.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I'd like to show the audience 3 pictures really quickly before asking you another question, Bestor. These next 3 pictures were taken by a Lexington resident. I know a lot of Lexington people know and love. He's also a Vietnam War era veteran, and that is Richard Robot. He was on the scene taking pictures of you that day. Here in the middle distance, you can see Arthur Johnson, Bestor's co-coordinator, in the light blue shirt. That's Bestor, you're walking next to him. And of course, you're coming into Lexington. Lexingtonians will know exactly where this is, coming on Mass Ave from the west. And again, pointing out in your fatigues. You took a detour through some side streets so that you could approach the battle green from the east, which is why, if you're in Lexington, this might initially seem puzzling. The idea being that if you could go down Mass Ave in front of all the stores, more people would see you, and it was an opportunity to continue to educate people. And for those who might not know, that is the chief of police talking in the car to the town manager, and they are keeping an eye on you. And there is Bestor almost in the exact middle of this photo, right above the hood of the car. And of course, UVAW is marching behind its flag. This is the 3rd picture of the veterans, again, approaching from that other direction. And I just wanted everyone to see you flashing the peace sign at the police station in an assertion that you were coming with the intent of assembling peaceably, as was your constitutional right. So at around dinner time, you were served VVAW's 2nd injunction. This one obtained by the Lexington Select Board from Massachusetts Superior Court, barring you and the other veterans from the green after 10 p.m. on that Saturday night of Memorial Day weekend. The injunction raised considerably the severity of any punishment that might be handed down. So at this point, it's clear to you that a mass arrest was a real possibility. And this picture shows you and the veterans having a pretty intense discussion about what to do, and then taking a vote. And as this picture, again, by Richard Robot, this wonderful picture shows, you voted and voted unanimously to stay on the green, even though you didn't have permission. And I wonder if you could tell us why you and the other veterans thought it was a good idea to proceed onto the green without permission from the select board.
Well, I think it's important to understand too, as you well know, Elise, and are so skilled in your book, Battle Green Vietnam, describing kind of the evolution of this particular march. And I think in terms of understanding the protests and understanding decisions that were made, it was iterative and was constantly reconstituted. This was not the first time we'd had a conversation or had a vote. This became part of the way in which we behaved with one another. We kept on having more people join us. And so in some respects, we were recommitting on a continuing basis to what we all had joined to do, knowing that new people had joined us and that it was important for them to also express and share that commitment with us. I think it's clear that we all felt that we did not need permission. We had sought permission and we had hoped to get it, but we didn't actually believe that we needed permission. We didn't feel we were being illegal. We felt what we had done in Vietnam was illegal. And so coming to these various different hallowed places, including Lexington Green, which was a place that honored the commitment of soldiers, we felt we were soldiers whose commitment needed to be honored. And so any consequence that might occur because of the injunction seemed to be clearly worthwhile given what we were trying to do, which was to take a stand. And I think that's what Lexington Green represents as a national monument, taking a stand. And that's what was in our minds and in our hearts. We were taking a stand. You know, it's interesting, we did not all agree as veterans politically about a variety of different issues. But the fact that what we did do here was unanimous in terms of our decisions showed that we were united in taking a stand against a war.
Yeah, Yeah. A few more quick slides before we go on to the next question, just again to set the scene for people. Those residents who supported you, Bestor, you and all of the veterans who participated, and as you point out, the number of veterans grew as the press got the word out about this showdown. The residents who supported you insisted that the select board call an emergency town meeting that night. And for Lexingtonians, I wanted them to see this picture of that emergency town meeting. Of course, everyone will recognize that this is in Cary Hall. People used phone chains in those days to alert each other. And this meeting was packed with 400 people. And at least one select board member commented that more people showed up than showed up for usual town meetings. There was a heated debate. There was a big police presence. You can see a police officer here. There were people, of course, who supported the select board that the green should not be used for camping, even if the campers were veterans. And there were a larger number of people, however, who did side with you. When the select board refused to reverse its decision, hundreds of civilians came to the green, both those who were in this town meeting and then those who they called from the payphones at Cary Hall. And we will ask Norma about this in just a moment. Then at 2 a.m. on Sunday morning, when the select board ordered a mass arrest, 166 Lexington adults, many more than that if we count minors, got arrested along with civilians from as far away as New York City. Add to this number some 200 veterans at this point, you being one of them, Bestor, and you're shown here getting arrested. We get a total of close to 500 people who got arrested. Here's a photo of John Kerry getting arrested, and of course that was posted in the Boston Globe. And I wanted everyone to see this picture because it makes clear that the Lexington, Arlington, and Bedford police wore riot helmets that night. As far as the police were concerned, there was a real possibility that a riot would ensue. The picture on the right here in the Globe shows that, on the other hand, entire Lexington families felt safe enough to get arrested with you. I mean, there's a little child here getting arrested with his or her parents. Everyone, veterans and civilians, spent the night on the hard, grease-slicked floor of the Lexington Town Garage on Bedford Street, which the authorities made into a makeshift jail. So, Bestor, what did the support of so many Lexington people mean to you and to the other veterans? And I'm asking both about that in the short term and in the long term.
Well, it's a lovely question to think about, because I think in some respects, protest marches unfold with barely a script that has actually followed. We have intentions and goals, and yet you don't actually know how everything is going to unfold, and you don't know how the various different issues that we're dealing with, including conflicts with the town and its rulings in the court, was going to cause reactions. But I think the fact that so many residents came to us ensured that our commitment to nonviolence was going to be something that was also going to be shared amongst everyone that particular night. There was that general sense of feeling a sense of belonging together, a collective appreciation. In fact, for many of us as veterans, when we had come home from Vietnam, it wasn't any parade or any sense of recognition for having served the country and having served in the war. And perhaps that was absolutely correct. But here there was a recognition for the fact that we were continuing to serve. So there was an appreciation, I think, amongst us as veterans that essentially we were being welcomed home. I think the outreach was shared too. It was two-way. So the fact that we were, in a sense, offering a permission to protest, and that permission was accepted. That what we were doing was right, and that the townspeople joined us and said, "We're with you." That had both that particular night a profound feeling of of a sense of just reinforcing your own feeling about a moral compass that you're trying to guide, about being part of a community that was going to reshape destiny. But that kind of experience of what happens in activism, where you feel a sense of a greater purpose because of being united with a larger number of people, enabled all of us, I think, to carry sort of the experience of this on into other activist aspects of our lives throughout our lives. So that's the long-term legacy of individual activism, individual joining with others to participate in a cause that you're committed to.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing screen in a second. Before I do, I just want to show yet again the side-by-side images of first the veterans and then last summer at the Lexington Minuteman statue. So I'm going to stop sharing screen, and then I have several questions for Norma, which I'm really looking forward to posing. So Norma, by way of an introduction, I'm going to tell everyone that in the early 60s, you moved to Lexington. And at that point, the minister at the First Parish asked you to provide car rides for migrant workers. That was the beginning of more and more political involvement until by 1971, when your children were 6 and 8, you were heading up the Lexington chapter of Citizens for Participation in Politics. And it was in that capacity that you got a call from VVAW's office in Cambridge, asking if you could organize people in Lexington to serve the veterans a spaghetti dinner on Saturday night.
Right.
It quickly became clear to you that a lot of people were keen to help with the dinner, but others were really angry about the veterans' plan to come to town. And things got pretty heated to the point that on the morning of the veterans' arrival, you got a couple of what you described in an interview, very angry anonymous phone calls. And I want to ask you, what do you think was going on in Lexington demographically that could help us understand the difference of opinion in town?
Yeah, plenty was going on in Lexington, excuse me, demographically. I do want to start out by saying, though, that one of the reasons that we're here tonight talking about this and is intertwined with the reason that it blew up in the way that it did with national publicity, as it turned out, was because of the particular misguided individual, the head of the Board of Selectmen, who had a number of issues that were uppermost in his mind about this particular event and the supposed behavior of the veterans and the townspeople. And also the fact that Lexington Oral History Projects began in 1991 rather, because of Eugenia Caledon, started to gather interviews of all parties concerned with this event, including the head of the Board of Selectmen, the chief of police, and participants of all sorts, including many veterans. And I want to give a special thank you to Eugenia Caledon. And what started her on this process in the first place was that in 1991, she asked Cary Library to have a small exhibit commemorating this event. And Cary Library thought this was not appropriate because the Gulf War was going on. This is not a time to celebrate protest. To that end, she decided to gather together a bunch of people who eventually developed this oral history project. And those included Nancy Ursay, Lenore Fenn, Eva Gordon, Bonnie Jones, Richard Robert, and our videographer, Kay Bell. The issue about demographics and the Board of Selectmen is interesting. You know, I say all of us, all of those people who were roughly my age at the time with young children had moved to town in the 1960s. And it was in the 1950s, the late 1950s, that it really began to change from what was a little bit of a sleepy rural town. And 128, remember, was just finished being built. It hadn't yet been finished, but it had been underway for a long time, but it was moving through Lexington in the 1960s. And this too brought other people to town who wouldn't have lived there otherwise. And these were different people than the people who were here before. I often think that, Tip O'Neill once said that all politics are local. Well, in a way that is true, but sometimes at the national level, a very large issue is being debated, which in reality, in its kernel, is a very small, narrow, local, and sometimes even personal issue. On the other hand, locally, for a local politician, it is sometimes just the opposite. The issue is a small one, in this case, a mere bylaw about the Battle Green, but in reality, a very big, deep, and also personal issue. Now, it's interesting when Bob Cataldo, who is the chairman of the Board of Selectmen, and he is the one who really pushed for this injunction so strongly that he drew other people together with him. His view of the town was very different than the people who moved in later. He had a close relationship at the time with St. Bridget's Church and felt all the clergy were sympathetic and, they were friends. They were people he knew. They were people who knew him. That was no longer the case. The clergy were very sympathetic to the anti-war movement. In fact, the minister at First Parish Church was responsible for writing the Shea-Wells Bill, which at the time was a way of hopefully declaring the war illegal, the Vietnam War. Having lost the closeness with the clergy, he expected to find it in other ways. This was like his town. He described it the way he liked to remember it. And that there are also all these different neighborhoods that people don't remember now existed at the time. There was an Irish area. The Italian, he was an Italian, his family were Italian immigrants that came here in the 1920s to farm. They lived in a certain area. A Jewish population populated Sylvia Street. And Bow Street and Reed Street were known as Italian settlements. The Yankees lived in the big mansions, as he put it, in Miriam Hill. Yeah. But he said they're all gone. I'm not sure that was true then, and it may not even be true now. But Yankees were the ones who ran the town, the old Yankees. I suppose he saw that as old money. He was the first new person at that time, the first non-Yankee to have an office in the town. And he became chairman of the Board of Selectmen. His anger at this issue, it ran deep. He felt he was instrumental in building so many things in the town that we just took for granted at the time. In fact, one good thing, the Conservation Commission was something that began under his tenure. And that's become ever so much more important today. So we were different people. The town became, I wouldn't say more crowded as it is now, but it definitely became busier. It had a different atmosphere to it. It became a suburb, and it was becoming a suburb in the 1970s and is ever so much more that today.
I think that is so helpful in understand all those changes that were taking place really help us understand why there could have been people on the green supporting the veterans at the same time as there were authorities who were opposing their presence there and doing what they could to keep the veterans off the green. You've explained in an interview that your parents were visiting that weekend and you had childcare as a result. And that gave you an opportunity to stay on the green with the veterans. Why did you feel it was important to do that?
I think just about everybody that I knew had feelings about Vietnam for a long time. We read the newspapers, we saw what happened. The throwing back of the medals impressed us deeply. That's just something almost inconceivable. If it hurts that much, if the pain is that great about Vietnam, it just can't be ignored. So we had read deeply about it, and a lot of us were involved in various other peripheral activities. And for a long time, a very small group of people used to walk around the flag on the green to protest the war, just silently, a silent vigil. Yeah. And I never participated in that because I thought, gee, that's just a waste of time. That looks so weak. That's not a demonstration somehow of strength. There are more of us who feel much more strongly than that. And of course, that was borne out by what happened that day. I was such an innocent. When I went for the permit to the Board of Selectmen, I thought I could just pick it up and walk out and say thank you. I didn't speak to Mr. Cataldo himself, but another selectman read me out and lost his temper. I was really taken aback. I was shocked. I had no idea this was going to be such a controversial issue. What happened later, though, as we went back to the green, was probably, I think Bestor in a way alluded to this feeling of union with the people, camaraderie with the people who came one after another. People came to the green spontaneously, which is what made it so beautiful. I mean, we had a telephone tree system, so we knew we were going to have plenty of spaghetti. People were happy to volunteer to do that. But to come down, commit yourself to a day spent hanging around the battle green on Memorial Day weekend. And what's more, not everybody was as lucky as I was that I had family watching the children. To run home, grab some sleeping bags, come back to the green and stay there late until it got chilly. But oddly enough, the later it got, the more beautiful it became. People were singing old Irish songs in one quarter. The veterans were huddled in other quarters. People were with family groups or friends, and it just went on and on. It was a beautiful thing. The only downside to this was, what I didn't learn until the next day, is that my parents had come up from New York for the weekend expecting to spend time with me. And I felt very proud of what I was doing. I felt proud of walking down the street. I fantasized that they would join me. I fantasized that they would congratulate me the next day and how it all worked out. But they didn't. They were terrified, especially because at 2 o'clock in the morning, one teenager, I forget who it was now, climbed up to the belfry in First Parish Church and began to ring the bell. And I lived on Mass Ave. That bell, though, was heard all over town. And as the bell tolled, I know my parents were thinking, oh my God, they're being beaten, they're being arrested, what's happening? This is horrible. And they were frightened for me without any reason to be, as it turned out, because I remember when we were arrested, the police, some of us knew some of the police, and there they were in their riot gear with the shields and the helmets, and some of them were smiling, some looked very apologetic, and some were just plain embarrassed. They hadn't really wanted to be in that position that they were put in. Another story we learned only later, there were two elderly women, probably in their 80s, who, when they heard what was going on, they drove around the green, saw the arrests were going on. First of all, why were they up at 2 o'clock in the morning? They must have been here at the green earlier. But they drove around, they finally parked the car, ran onto the green and begged to be arrested. But alas, there was no more room in the buses. They had taken as many of us as they were going to take. If they had another bus, they might have even arrested more people. So it was a pretty grand event. Yeah. And the beauty of it there too was what happened was, it was almost like a gift to the anti-war movement, as it turned out, just the exact opposite of what the people who opposed this might have hoped for. And so it worked out in the years that passed.
I'm so glad you described the ringing of the bells, because so many people in their interviews remember that as a moment that will stay with them forever. And I think in part because it did remind people of 1775, right? Because church bells were used to help spread the warning that the troops were en route to Concord. And so my understanding of the church bells is one reason it felt so important to people was that time did collapse there, and it was 1775 and it was 1971 at the same time. And I think that's just remarkable that one of the things that happened during this event is that you created this kind of wormhole or time travel, which is really just remarkable. I wanted to follow up about the Lexington Oral History Project, and I was so glad you mentioned all the names of your colleagues who worked on that. And it's worth mentioning that you interviewed over 60 people, and it was the 90s, so you videotaped people. Then you transferred all of these to DVDs. You transcribed many of them, and you created this fabulous repository or archive for people like me. Other scholars use it for different reasons. And I wanted to ask why you thought it was so important that people never forget what happened on Lexington Battle Green over Memorial Day weekend 50 years ago.
I think the answer is almost obvious, because it keeps on happening.
Say something about that.
Yes, well, when I hear the arguments for not protesting, let's say with Black Lives Matter is a very good example, actually. When I hear the fears that people have of, people are going to wreck the place. This is going to be, there's going to be looting, there's going to be this, there's going to be that. They're all the fears. And it's like, if you allow this, then it's a slippery slope. This is the same argument we heard at this event, which, as we know, was very, very, very cleanly done. And there was no such thing happening. Our memories are so short, though. We don't seem to be able to keep in our heads that protest, dissent is something that we owe it to ourselves as citizens to be able to do. We see what happens in other countries when people are not permitted dissent. We see the pressure on journalists all over the world. This is a continuing injustice, and I think we have to remember events like this, even though it was, relatively speaking, a small event in a relatively small town, and nobody was injured, no one died, nothing dramatic happened in that sense, and yet it meets all the criteria of an injustice. The level of injustice doesn't matter. An injustice is an injustice, is justice unserved.
Oh, thank you so much. Sarah, I can see there's a lot of activity in the chat, which is fantastic. And one of the things I saw go by really briefly was that vvaw.org was posted there. VVAW continues to exist, and there was an invitation there if you were arrested to share your memories in writing with VVAW. So please do check out the chat. But Sarah, do you want to field some questions for our panelists from the audience?
Definitely, and thank you to Elise and Bestor and Norma. This has been amazing so far. As I'm sure you have noticed, there is quite a lot of discussion already going on in the chat. People are sharing their stories. What is really great is seeing some of these folks who were children at the time as well. A lot of teenagers who were there, which is always interesting to hear the different perspectives of the organizers versus some of the people who came into this after the fact. Karen mentioned that she had to go back to court a second time because she was just wearing jeans and a t-shirt because she was 16 and they said that was not acceptable for a court hearing. So please do continue to share your memories there, as well as officially with the VVAW.
I did want to, could I just jump in here for a second? There's a comment here about don't use select board, no anachronisms. Carolyn, I want to assure you that in my book, I refer to them as the selectmen. I absolutely stick to 1971 parlance. So point well taken. I thought there might be young people here tonight for whom that wouldn't resonate, but yeah, point well taken, thank you.
Great. Well, I think we'll start with, we do have a question here for Bestor. Jeff is interested in how this event affected the VVAW. Did the chapter grow very much after word of this got out?
Are you muted? Am I unmuted? Yeah.
Yep.
Interesting question. And you're asking me to now try to remember sort of in terms of numbers. I would say that I'm not certain if I can give you any statistics that would back up a change in terms of the organization in terms of numbers. Remarkably, and actually even by some of the people who are joining us tonight, the band of brothers stayed together for many, many months, if not years, in terms of activities. So this was one of a number of different expressions of activism, and that was pursued and continued to be pursued by VVAW. In some respects, it's interesting to note that VVAW did not have a political agenda other than to end the war, and that this became more and more complicated within the organization as competing political agendas surfaced and divided the organization in terms of its members. And I think that, certainly up to the point in which we had come to Lexington, based upon our experiences in Operation Raw, and then down at Dewey Canyon 3 in Washington, D.C., and the Winter Soldier investigation, our agenda had been unanimous in terms of bringing an end to the war and using our service as a way in which to provide evidence of why this war should not continue. But the organization it began to be like a lot of other organizations where it was splintered by competing interests. But as Jeff has indicated to us already tonight, that VVAW continues to exist. I'm also always fascinated by the fact that there is an organization of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans against the war, and they continue to take a stand.
And I'll point out, again, the chat, there's so much great stuff in the chat, but Ross Fenton is here tonight, which is fantastic. And of course, he started the Rhode Island chapter of VVAW. And it's just worth mentioning to people that the New England chapter was in Cambridge. The New England chapter organized this march and then invited the Connecticut chapter and the Rhode Island chapter to attend, which they did. And that was fantastic. And Ross is saying in the chat that the Rhode Island chapter gained strength after that and had several events later that summer. There is a huge history book about VVAW by Gerald DeCosia that goes into several other events that, of course, occur in the years that followed, including the occupation of the Statue of Liberty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Bestor, actually, I thought what you were going to say too is that the brotherhood has continued in terms of friendships. I mean, you were in touch with Howard Baker or Howie Baker, Arthur Johnson, I mean, several people. And by the way, when I posted about this event on the VVAW Facebook page, which I gather you are not on, people said, "Hi, Bestor." So, it has been a lasting relationship in other ways. Someone is asking, is John Kerry still a member? That's a whole nother ball of wax. Of course, if anyone followed his presidential campaign, there's an entire story to be told about that. This is just an opportunity for me to say, and to correct maybe some of the record here, John Kerry was VVAW's national spokesman in the winter of 70-71 and was instrumental in approaching Bestor, Chris Gregory, Arthur Johnson, Jerry Lund, a whole bunch of Vietnam veterans who were counseling active duty GIs, but he did not organize this march. He did attend, which was fabulous because 6 weeks earlier, he had become instantly nationally famous because of his testimony in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was living in Waltham, so it wasn't difficult in terms of traveling to come to the march, but it helped attract media attention. And of course, in terms of what the Boston Globe put on the cover of the arrest, they chose a photograph of him. Not a member anymore, did not organize this event. Even in 2010, when we gathered in Kerry Hall to again review what happened in 1971, there was still some confusion that Kerry had organized this, but Arthur Johnson was the one, my understanding, it's probably came up with the idea of reversing Paul Revere's ride, and it was very much organized by Bestor and Arthur with help from just a large number of people. I profile 6 veterans in my book. Ross Fenton is one of them. Don Carrico is another one. He's on here tonight. Just, Lenny Rotman, so many people. So one of the things Bestor and Arthur did is when it came time to speak to the public, over the course of the march, VVAW always brought sound equipment. I mean, always thinking about communication and how to be in touch with the public. You didn't give the microphone to John Kerry because I think there was a concern that it might be hijacked by someone who was perceived to, have a different agenda than your particular local march. So it was really your event. I think it's just worth saying that. No, absolutely no disrespect to John Kerry, who came to this event, like I said, and lent his strength to that. And that was incredibly important. But I did just want to set the record straight in terms of organizers.
Well, I think you're absolutely correct. And in the way in which you've characterized that, Al Hubbard, who was the executive secretary or national director of BVAW, was a participant in the event as well. And he, like John, marched and participated with us. But it was the New England chapter that ran this. And we were the folks that were putting out the press. We were the folks that were rewriting scripts as we were going along. And we were the folks that were essentially engaged in the negotiations that took place, both with clergy, with selectmen, and with all of the authorities and police at various different places we were at. So it was an event that was conducted by the local veterans of the New England chapter and those from Rhode Island and Connecticut, as you say. I wanted to mention, however, just since you brought up John too, it's worth reading John's testimony at the Senate committee. It's amazing. You can take the word Vietnam out of the words that he shared and put in the word Afghanistan, and it's extraordinary. But I think what John was able to put into words essentially gave all of us as veterans a sense of understanding a sacrifice that we were no longer ever going to support. And John was enormously eloquent in his ability to do that, but he was right on. He hit the note perfectly.
And he did, when it came time late at night to have those final negotiations between you and the select board, he did join in with you there, as did Al Hubbard, right? There was this final sort of attempt by the clergy in town, right? And so I do have some film footage of that if we have time and people want to look at that. I can show it. It's 2 minutes of film footage. But Sarah, maybe you have another question you want to relay.
They couldn't resist.
I really want to show it, but I'll wait and see what Sarah says.
Yeah, one thing I thought it was worth pointing out is we do have a lot of commentary here that speaks to this being such a community event, which is so fascinating, just how everyone came together sort of on both sides. Spencer Sullivan mentioned that Hancock Church was the attic, which was the Lexington Teen Center. So everyone saw the commotion on the green and all of the high school kids rushed out to join. And we also have someone who believes they know the person who owned the bus company who hauled everyone off, a Mr. Cataldo. So I don't know if he was a Lexington resident.
Yes, that is the chairman of the board of selectmen, who also owns buses that were used to transport everyone, which is interesting. I wanted to just point out too that John Grossman is writing in the chat that his whole family went down to the Green to join the veterans. He was 16 and was arrested with his father, a World War II veteran. And John Grossman, what fascinates me is you say your father offered his war medals as bail when the police started to ask for identity in the jail. I have read about that in the Boston Globe, but I never had a name to put to that story. So I really appreciate hearing about that. Thank you. That is just, just inspired to also give up his medals and World War II medals. Oh, and Dawn is saying a shout out to Betty Levin, and I wanted to say something about her as well. Betty Levin, a longtime Lincoln resident, as I grew up in Lincoln, and my parents are still there. It was Betty's daughter, Jennifer, who was a teenager who reenacted Paul Revere for the veterans. On the one hand, you had Peter Wilson reenacting a modern Paul Revere in his Land Rover, but you also wanted to have a traditional looking Paul Revere ride up to the veterans and deliver the message that they then conveyed, that the war needed to end. And she was a teenager and dressed up in a surtout or cape and rode her horse up to the Old North Bridge. And Jennifer sadly has passed away, but her mother, Betty, Dawn, I want to tell you, I did try to see if she could come tonight. She's in a memory unit, at the Concord nursing home. So sadly, she's not with us, but so many people do remember her. And, a protest takes a lot of behind the scenes organizing, as you're pointing out, right? I mean, you need food. She told me that she didn't get arrested because someone needed to call the porta potty company and have them come and empty the porta potties, and that was not easy to have done on a Sunday of a long weekend. So she was constantly behind the scenes. She was the one who went with the veterans to the National Park Service and made sure the veterans had permission to stay overnight at the Old North Bridge. She did a lot to enable this march, and I just love, Dawn, that you are giving her a shout out. That just means a lot to me as someone who grew up knowing her, and also just on behalf of Jennifer, who I did interview for the book and was just a wonderful person and remembered just with so much gratitude the opportunity the veterans gave her to participate in an anti-war protest. Her father was one of the founders of Citizens for Participation in Politics, so a comrade of Norma's. And he had polio and was in a wheelchair as a result, and was also not able to get arrested. A whole other part of the story is that the Lexington/Arlington/Bedford police did refuse to arrest a lot of the veterans who were injured, which was upsetting to a lot of veterans. And there are just so many individual stories. I try to tell a lot of them in my book. And the Lexington Oral History Project certainly tells a lot of them in their fantastic archive. But yeah, I mean, we haven't touched on everything, but I think we've touched on all the big things, which has been fantastic. Sarah, I haven't opened the Q&A, but is there anything else in that, or?
Nope, we've got quite a few stories going back and forth in the chat, and thanks to Jeff for posting John Kerry's testimony and another link to the VVAW for submissions. We might want to give folks a moment to ruminate. Perhaps now might be a good time to show some of that footage.
I really want to, because it's in color, and because again, Bestor mentioned that Arthur just passed away, and this is just some wonderful color footage of Bestor and Arthur trying to work something out with Robert Cataldo. With John Kerry there as well. So I think I have this queued up. We'll see if I can do this. Maybe I can't, I don't know, let's see. You'll have to give me a minute to see if I can do this. Yeah, can you see this, see it now?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Great, okay, so literally I'm just gonna show 2 minutes. This is the part, I showed you a still image of this before. Lexington townspeople, 400 of them at Cary Hall having an emergency town meeting with most people there, I would say, trying to convince the select board in today's world to change their minds. There is no sound, so I'll maybe just provide a voiceover. So here we are in Cary Hall. You get a sense of how many people. The police presence, again, quite a few people in their Lexington Oral History Project interviews recalled being appalled at the number of police that the chief sent down. Here is Chairman Cataldo and the other selectmen. There was applause on both sides. I don't know which moment this is. Now, here is John Kerry walking with the chairman of the selectmen. You see some police officers there conferring there again. And there's Arthur right there with the beard right there and the fatigue jacket. And now here comes Bestor. And so I just love this moment of seeing the two organizers together walking with Cataldo on Arthur's other side and John Kerry behind them. It's just a lovely moment I wanted to show because Arthur obviously is not here today. And then John Kerry, again, just attracting a lot of media attention because of this incredible speech he had just given. But that moment where Bestor and Arthur are conferring, I think makes clear that they are the leaders here. I just wanted to share that.
Can I just mention something? We have kind of a bad guy in this picture who is the chairman of the Board of Selectmen, Robert Cataldo. But I also wanted to say there was a graciousness about him after the fact, of course. When we interviewed him, his last words were, "If you need any help from me, please let me know. I'd be happy to be of some help." What he meant by that, I don't really know. And he was gracious enough, I suppose you could say, or maybe foolish enough, to participate in a commemoration of this day that we had earlier in 2010, where he also was vilified by most of the crowd, which was very pro-veterans and pro-protest. So anyway, for the record, I feel I should say that.
And I will say too that he also is one of the founders, if I understand correctly, of the community college system in Massachusetts, which is no small feat. In my own book about the march, I really don't talk about him too much because I think that he legitimately felt that the role of a memorialized battle green is to stop at the sacred birth time, to preserve the fact of its always being April 19th, 1775. I think most Americans share that sense that that's what memorialization is for. It's to keep open that portal to the sacred moment. It's a place where clock time or chronological time is not supposed to function. And of course, the veterans were starting clock time on the green. They were advancing the clock to 1971. So I did decide in my own book not to mention him by name, not to talk about any kind of personal history of his or local history, because I personally took quite seriously his sense of responsibility. And what I came to appreciate is that he had a perfectly reasonable philosophy widely shared about the purpose of memorialization. And the veterans decided that in committing civil disobedience, they would accept the punishment. So there's a morally right foundation on both sides. And the fact that everyone agreed to disagree peaceably, for me, is really the point. But that was just a decision that I made after many years of pondering how to handle the fact of Mr. Cataldo's refusal to give the veterans permission.
You know, I look at his position too also. He's not a lone voice. We were a polarized nation. It would be wrong to characterize Lexington as one voice against what the veterans stood for and what the residents stood for. There was dissension throughout every single town and county throughout this country during that. And in some respects, it's a reminder of the era that we live in now, where again, we are very polarized. We are living amongst, conflicting ideas and conflicting interpretations of history. And there's the phrase, the past is always present. Well, the past was very present with Bob Cataldo in the way in which he expressed himself, but he was not just expressing Bob Cataldo. There was other voices that were heard and spoken for by him, just as there are today by so many people who, in some respects, are still locked in a past that has not come forward to the present that we want.
Yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
Well, thank you. I mean, Sarah, is there anything else we should talk about, or should we just?
A couple quick, well, I don't know if this is quick. We can try and keep it quick, but there is a very interesting question that actually came up during our rehearsal. Someone has mentioned that their mother saw the state police were kind of keeping a low profile during this, and they're wondering if there were any other reports and thoughts about what your interactions with the police were like that evening.
Esther, do you want to take that, or Norma?
Well, to those of us who were arrested, I would say that they were non-confrontational. They were not angry. There was no anger as far as the police were concerned with the people on the green, us residents. But we're white middle-class people. We would have been surprised if there had been anything different in their reaction. But for the veterans, they may have had different feelings. Bestor?
Well, we were constantly on a daily basis sort of reminded by Chairman Cataldo, as well as the police, that they were hearing threats of outside intruders who were going to create trouble. So they were, in some respects, at least expressing to us that they were on edge, and that a lot of their decision-making was based upon public safety and their concern because they were being informed that way. They never came to us in a way in which was disruptive to our public safety. And I think certainly we did not have any sense that anybody that we were in contact with had any intention of being disruptive to public safety. But I know that within the town authorities, that was one of the concerns, at least they were sharing publicly with us, as a motivation for some of their decision making, or certainly their sense of wanting to keep us apprised of what was some of the strategies that they were thinking about.
And I'll just chime in quickly to say the FBI was keeping a close eye on you, as evidenced by the FBI files. Both the chief of police in Concord and in Lexington made daily reports to the FBI. So, it's just interesting to think about the fact that you were monitored, hounded. I'm not sure how you would put that, but.
Well, we occasionally actually were in touch with the FBI on our own. There were threats at different times in which we needed to include the FBI about what was happening from a safety point of view. We actually knew each other by name. They would show up at the events that we were proposing. And I'm being invaded by my grandson, who's joining me now. Can you say hello?
Hi. Hi. How are you?
Good.
Just back from a swim. But what happened, I think, was it wasn't like the FBI were our friends, but there was a need at times for us to inform them of threats that occurred to us from outsiders that disagreed with what we were doing. And they made a point of making themselves known to us when they were in attendance at various different activities. Although for this particular operation, POW, we were pretty busy. I was unaware of them.
Looking back on those times when Bestor was talking about the length of his hair, those times were fraught, I think is the right word. The length of your hair. In fact, there's a song by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young from that day about cutting your hair. That meant something. That was a statement in itself, not just with VVAW, but with people in high school. Those who wore their hair long, they had certain beliefs. You could almost take that as a given. And those who had crew cuts still, they probably supported the war. I mean, that was the way things were headed. They weren't quite as divided, I still feel as we are now, but still the feelings were very strong. It wasn't necessarily the Republican Democrat thing that we see now, but it was cut in a little bit different way. But yeah, division is division, and fear of the other is still fear of the other. And, you know, if you had your hair long, you were a hippie, and hippies did things that other people thought were not good. You know, generalization based on a lack of knowledge, but that is how it was.
Someone is asking in the chat how they can watch Bestor's film, and I wanted to explain that some young filmmakers from New York going to graduate school in filmmaking at Columbia reached out to the VVAW New England office and asked if they could follow the march, which they did with multiple film crews. And then Hart Perry, who was in charge of that, he was intending to make a short film that was supposed to be broadcast on PBS. And PBS said, which was new, PBS was a new entity at the time. PBS said it was too one-sided. So to get to this point about, you know, it being a very divided time, the film was considered too one-sided, too in support of the veterans, and it was not aired. However, later, Bestor and another colleague co-directed a documentary about the march using Hart Perry's film footage. And that film, I'll type it into the chat, is called Unfinished Symphony. And you can download, you can buy that and download it on Amazon. But it is also running this weekend on LexMedia. And Bestor and I met on the Lexington Battle Green on Monday and did a brief interview that will run either before or after. But you can check LexMedia and watch it for free this weekend, probably 2 times. I'm not sure exactly when, but definitely check that out. There's some really interesting moments where residents are interviewed. So there, it includes interviews with veterans, but also my favorite moment is a woman coming out from her house in Concord, and she's you know, she's maybe in her 70s or 80s, I don't know, but she's wearing a dress. She looks very proper. And she's asked about these guys coming by in long hair and fatigues, right? This half hippie, half soldier. And the expectation on the part of the film crew is that she's going to say, you know, I want them to get the hell out of here. And she goes, I want them to march. I'm going to start crying. She's like, I want them to march all the way to Vietnam and bring everyone home. And then she flashes the peace sign. I mean, you have to see this movie. So please do check that out this weekend.
Can I just add to that, just to make sure everybody understands? So this was a production that came out of the Lexington Oral History Project.
Yes.
So actually the very first credit that comes up is the Lexington Oral History Project, and then Northern Light Productions, which produced the film.
That's right.
And many of the voices that are in the film come from the recordings that were done during the Lexington Oral History Project tapings. And so they became sort of a foundation for the film. And Hart Perry's short film is just a brilliant film. It's fascinating just in terms of its some of its visual techniques that were far ahead of the time.
And you can watch that short film at my website, which I just typed into the chat. On one of the pages, I think it's called The March. If you scroll down, you can watch. I think it's like an 9 minute film. And my favorite moment in that film, spoiler alert, is the Vietnam veterans marching, and then it sort of merges with a group of reenactors from the colonial period marching to make the point, to nicely make the point about how Vietnam veterans presented themselves as our ancestors, as the direct descendants of our ancestors who founded the country. Shall we stop there, Sarah?
Very poignant. Yes, I think that's.
I want to read through all the chat, but there's some great stuff here. But I think that might be this might be a good time to stop.
Well, you put in a plug for watching the film Unfinished Symphony, and I think that this is a film that has had a long connection to Lexington and a long life on its own. And in some sense, one of the things that I like the most about the film is it characterizes the atmosphere of an era. And I think this is one of the things that's strongest about the book that you have written, Elise, is that you've both characterized sort of a tone of life and thinking 50 years ago, but you also kind of connected it, not kind of, you did connect it to both a way in which people thought 250 years ago. or 225 years ago. I'm being a little inaccurate in the years, and it's to your credit in terms of helping us process history, in recognizing that not only is the past present, but that there is meaning in the past for the present. And you are so skilled in terms of what you've done with your book of helping us understand a history that in some respects, because we live here, we take some of it a little bit for granted. And you've delved deeply into providing us access to the significance and power of place and hallowed ground and what sacrifice means and what memorial means. So thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And I want to add something about this talk about capturing a moment in time. I think much of the oral history interviews also capture a town at a moment in time. Another thing beginning around then was the women's movement. And many of our female interviewers have comments about that. Many of us at the time were just beginning to find our careers. And this is partly why so many women at that time had time to volunteer in local organizations. This is why the telephone tree was probably mostly women, because that's the way it worked. When it came time to run for office, though, it was the men who ran. I mean, this was not that long ago, and yet another era. In fact, you talked earlier about calling the selectmen selectmen. There was, even then, there was a woman who was a member of the selectmen. They were still called selectmen nevertheless, but she was away for the weekend and was someone who would not have gone along quite the way some of the select board members voted, but she was never called in until it was really too late and there was no chance for a reversal. But it's a moment in time for a changing community, and a community that has to come to grips with the powers that be arresting its own citizens. I mean, that made an impact, and it was felt for a long time to come. And there were changes in the next election. And I think many of those changes morphed into other things over time, but that was really the big first obvious open schism in town. And that doesn't often happen to a town, that it has a moment like this to look at itself and see people lined up on different sides and realize that it was not the town in many ways that some of us perhaps thought it was.
I see another name in the chat that I recognize. Howie Baker is here, and he was a very important member of VVAW New England. And I have lots of wonderful pictures of him, and I had the honor and pleasure of interviewing him. So I just wanted to say hello to him. I think he explained to me that how important it was that VVAW operated democratically, that every decision was made with a lot of discussion, and that everyone was learning how to facilitate discussion so that everyone was heard. And so that by the time there was a vote, everyone had an opportunity to speak. And several veterans have said how important Howie was in, I hope it's okay that I call you Howie, Howard Baker was in that process. So just lots of people, everyone brought a special skill, whether that's Don bringing his food experience, right? I mean, at one point, Lenny Rotman told me, well, if you're going to feed all these people, you need to have utensils. And so he knew someone in the plastic industry. I mean, just the sheer amount. Now I'm getting into the mundane after all these lovely, really lofty comments, but it's just worth remembering how much energy went into this. 3 days of marching with so many people. It just took so much effort and coordination. And of course, everyone brought from the military those abilities to divide and conquer a task. It's just really, for me, it's just delightful to see these names that I recognize, because I don't think individuals know how many other people remember them. I'll be interviewing one veteran who will say, oh, and so did this. And you never know how important you are to someone necessarily.
And, you know, it's funny too, how things happen. I have no idea how the spaghetti actually got made or how it got handed out. It was like the story of the loaves and fishes. How did it multiply? How in the world did so many people add their little bit to make it possible to feed, what, 150, 200, 300 without any notice, without a budget? Pretty amazing. The whole thing was in many ways pretty amazing.
I think that is a good place to stop.
That was very eloquently said. I just wanted to let everyone know there's been a lot of discussion and link sharing and such in the chat, which a lot of it is sort of getting eaten up by the larger chat. So I have compiled all of this, and we will be sending along all of the relevant links to everyone who is here tonight. But I'd like to thank Elise and Bestor and Norma so much for joining us this evening. It has been quite a trip down memory lane for all of us.
And a march into the future as young protesters learn from VBAW some of the techniques that can be used to mobilize the past for a better future.
Yes, and thank you so much, Elise, for putting this together, as well as the Historical Society.
Yes, thanks to the
Thank you
Historical
all.
Society. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank
Hope you
you.
have a wonderful Memorial Day, and we also hope that you can join us this year for our 4th of July program, which we will be hosting as usual, which will hopefully be in person, outdoors, held safely. So we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks so much, everyone.
Good night.